On a day when all over the world we are celebrating Good Friday, I wish to take you through the passion and resurrection predictions in the Gospel of Mark and compare them with similar passion and resurrection predictions in the Gospel of John. In Mark 8:31, 9:31, and 10:32 to 34, three times Jesus has predicted that he will suffer, he will be crucified, he will die, and he will be raised on the third day. Jesus never predicts his passion without at the same time also predicting his resurrection. And that is why they are called not merely passion predictions, but passion and resurrection predictions. In the Gospel of John, these take a slightly different form. In 3:14, 8:28, and 12:32, three times Jesus speaks about what is known as hupsu. Hupsu might be translated as lifted up on the cross and therefore crucified. But hupsu might also be translated as lifted up into heaven and therefore ascended. So by the use of hupsu, John has Jesus predict both his being lifted up on the cross and crucified, and his being lifted up into heaven and exalted. And in all of these, the point which the evangelists make are very clearly that the cross is necessary, the cross is required, but the cross is the only way to salvation. The cross is that step which Jesus must take before he can be raised. And because this year on Passion Sunday we read from the Gospel of Mark, I would like to go through a few incidents in the Passion narrative of Mark to make it relevant for us today. I want to begin with the prayer of Jesus in Gethsemane and possibly communicate through Mark's narration how Jesus teaches us to pray. Mark chapter 14, verses 31 to 41, the prayer of Jesus. Jesus is disturbed. He is troubled. He knows that the future does not look too bright for him. And in this state of mind, he takes with him three of possibly the closest of his disciples: Peter, James, and John. In other words, you might say that he needs human company. He needs his disciples to show solidarity. He needs his disciples to be with him. And as he takes them along into the garden, he only asks that they stay awake and watch, while he goes away to pray. And the first point that we need to understand is this, that when Jesus is caught in a dilemma, when he does not know which way he needs to turn, when he's caught at the crossroads, you might say, and when there is a question in his mind about what he must do, he turns to prayer. He turns to his Father. He turns to ask God for help. Surely his companions are also with him. Surely the 3 disciples also accompany him. Surely he asks them to sit and watch while he prays. But primarily, Jesus turns to his Father. And even as he goes to pray, we notice that his disposition, even before the content of his prayer, is one of surrender. Because Jesus throws himself on the ground. It is a disposition which says that he acknowledges God to be supreme. He acknowledges the Father to be in control. And he acknowledges that he is dependent on the Father's will. That is what it means when Jesus throws himself on the ground. And in his prayer, Jesus is direct. In his prayer, Jesus is simple. In his prayer, Jesus does not use big confusing words, but simply asks for what he wants. He states his petition unashamedly. He states his petition without reserve before the Father. And his prayer is, Father, take this cup away from me. And even though there are no 2 parts to the prayer, because it is one prayer, we can look at what we might call the second part, namely, not my will, but yours be done. In other words, while Jesus unashamedly asks for the desire of his heart, while Jesus asks directly for what he thinks will be better for him and that this cup be taken away, he knows in the deepest recesses of his heart that the Father's will for him will be much better than anything he could imagine. And that is why, because it is practical, because it is down to earth, because it is the better way for him, Jesus adds, not my will, but yours be done. And a similar prayer is made 3 times, because Jesus prays like the pious Jew who prayed also 3 times. And so Mark portrays a Jesus who is dependent on his Father. Mark portrays a Jesus who asks unashamedly. Mark portrays a Jesus who adds to his prayer, not my will, but yours. And even though Jesus does not hear the Father's voice at this time, even though Jesus prays 3 times and does not get any seeming direction from the Father, the voice which called him beloved Son at the baptism, The voice which called him beloved son at the transfiguration is a voice which is silent now. And yet, Jesus gets up from his prayer fortified. Jesus gets up from his prayer strengthened. Jesus gets up from his prayer ready to face whatever might come. And so therefore, through this prayer of Jesus, may I suggest to you the 4 steps that are visible. And the first is the disposition. The first is the attitude. The first is to acknowledge dependence on God and to know that God is in control. The second is the content of my prayer. There is no need to use philosophical jargon. There is no need to use theological vocabulary, because God understands even the simplest of words. So I speak in simple words about my heart's desire. I ask unashamedly for what I want, no matter what it might be. No matter even if I think it is ridiculous, I ask God for it unashamedly. The third, I do not forget to add like Jesus did, not my will, but yours. And finally, the result of my prayer must fortify me. The result of my prayer must be that I am ready to face the challenges of life. The result of my prayer must be that no matter what will happen in my day, I am now strengthened only because I have prayed. I may not hear the Father's voice like Jesus never heard the Father's voice. I may not see the Father's face like Jesus never saw the Father's face in Gethsemane. And yet I get up from my prayer, and yet I arise from my prayer strengthened and fortified. And how is this strength seen in the prayer of Jesus and in the response of Jesus? Because only in Mark, when the arresting party comes to arrest Jesus after his prayer and Judas kisses him, he's not even aware of Judas, because he's looking straight ahead. So he doesn't address Judas at all. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says to Judas, "Friend, why are you here?" In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus asks Judas, "Judas, will you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" In the Gospel of John, Jesus asks the all-important question, "Tina zeteis," whom are you looking for? But in the Gospel of Mark, because he is strengthened in his prayer, he does not utter a word to Judas. As soon as they lay hands on him, a fight breaks out, and someone strikes the high priest's slave on the ear. Luke and John tell us that it was the right ear. John tells us that the one who drew the sword was Peter, and the name of this high priest slave was Malchus. And yet Mark does not give us any names. If in Matthew the response of Jesus is, "No more of this. Do you not think that I can ask my Father to send angels down to earth?" In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus heals the man's ear. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells Peter, "Put your sword back in its scabbard." Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? But in Mark, Jesus is not even aware that a fight has broken out. Jesus is looking straight ahead because he has been fortified. He has been strengthened in his prayer. The only words of Jesus in the garden are, "Let the scriptures be fulfilled." Let the scriptures be fulfilled means let God's will be done. Jesus had prayed in Gethsemane that he wanted the Father's will to be done. He now shows it practically, that he knows that the Father's will, which is his arrest now, is better for him than his own will for himself. You might read as you go along the trials before the Sanhedrin and the trial before Pilate in Mark chapter 14, verses 53 to 72, and Mark chapter 15, verses 1 to 20. And I will summarize these trials for you in that the trial before the Sanhedrin is a religious trial. The questions are about the temple and about Son of God. The trial before Pilate is a political trial. Pilate wants to know whether Jesus is a king and the king of the Jews. These questions about the temple and about whether Jesus is Son of God and whether Jesus is King of the Jews are answered by Mark at the death of Jesus. In chapter 15, verses 38 and 39 of Mark, two events occur which answer these questions. And the two events are, first, the veil of the temple is torn from top to bottom. What does the veil of the temple being torn from top to bottom mean? Our minds go back to the baptism of Jesus, when the heavens were rent open and when the voice spoke. A similar verb is used by Mark to indicate that the veil is now rent open. At that foundational experience of the baptism of Jesus, the heavens were rent open. Now, at the death of Jesus, the veil is rent open. This means that God can no longer be found behind the veil. God can no longer be found in the tabernacle. Now, true worship is on the cross. Now, God can be found on the cross. Now, God is present in Jesus crucified. And this is confirmed when the voice from earth, the voice of the centurion now, the Gentile, the unbeliever, when the Gentile, the centurion, speaks and recognizes Jesus as Son of God. Truly, he says, this man, referring to Jesus crucified, was Son of God. In other words, the question of the Jews, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And when Jesus says, I am, is now answered practically by the one who has spread his arms out in total surrender. The one whose death has caused the veil of the temple to be torn. And the one whose death has caused the Gentile, the centurion, to say that this was God's Son. The title on the cross very clearly indicates that Jesus, therefore, is King of the Jews. And what the voice invited Jesus to do at his baptism, to be the king and servant, to be the servant king, to be the king who becomes king by being servant, is made visible on the cross. And so today, as we enter into the mystery of Good Friday, let us draw strength when we have to carry our own crosses. Let us not ask for crosses. Let us not ask for suffering, because Jesus was not a sadist. He never asked to suffer. He never looked for crosses everywhere. But if they came, he was unafraid. If they came, he was willing to carry them. If they came, he would not shy away. To those of you who are carrying heavy burdens and heavy crosses, I say, draw inspiration from the crucifix. Draw inspiration from the cross of the Lord. Draw inspiration from his prayer in Gethsemane, and know that even if you cannot hear the Father's voice at this time, even if at this time you cannot see the Father's face, like in the case of Jesus, the Father accompanies you on your journey. Like in the case of Jesus, the Father walks ahead of you. Like in the case of Jesus, the Father strengthens you to carry your cross.